This airplane could bankrupt aviation. It consumes so much fuel that a single flight costs more than the annual operation of a small airport. It is the only one in the world that can carry a load weighing almost 300,000 pounds. And it can carry not just tanks in its hold, but entire mobile army headquarters. And in 1974, this monster was part of the craziest military experiment. The drop of a Minuteman intercontinental ballistic missile warhead from an altitude of 40,000 feet. The C-5 Galaxy is not just a big airplane, it's a true aerial monster that changed military aviation with its arrival. Its development began in the 1960s, when the U.S. Air Force realized they needed an aircraft capable of transporting any equipment, even the heaviest tanks and artillery complexes. An aircraft that could cover intercontinental distances without refueling and deploy troops directly into conflict zones. But the more Lockheed engineers tried to implement this project, the more it defied common sense. A length of almost 250 feet, a height of over 65 feet, and a wingspan of more than 220 feet. When the first C-5 took to the skies in 1968, many experts were convinced that this aircraft simply would not meet expectations. It was too expensive, too complex to operate, too cumbersome. But time proved otherwise. The C-5 became an indispensable tool in military logistics. It transports two M1 Abrams tanks weighing 140 tons, moves strategic weapons, and it was even used by NASA to transport spacecraft components. Moreover, in 1975, this aircraft was at the forefront of a humanitarian mission. Despite the enormous costs, technical difficulties, and accidents, the C-5 Galaxy not only remained in service but continues to carry out critically important missions. It proves that even the most insane engineering solution can become a necessity when it comes to global air dominance. A walking violation of the laws of aerodynamics. With its weight of 840,000 pounds, it seems impossible that it can even take off. But it does, tearing through the air with four powerful turbofan engines that together produce over 200,000 pounds of thrust. These same engines allow it to cover over 8,000 miles without refueling, making it one of the longest-range military transport aircraft in history. The design of the C-5 was developed with one purpose: to transport cargo that simply doesn't fit in other aircraft. Its cargo bay is over 140 feet long, and the ceiling is so high that a two-story structure can be installed inside. An entire squadron of equipment can be loaded into this hold, from armored vehicles to mobile command posts and even parts of spacecraft. But to make all this possible, engineers had to develop a unique layout. Unlike most transport aircraft, the C-5 has two decks. The upper deck houses the crew and passengers, and the lower deck is the main cargo area. This allows for the simultaneous transport of equipment and military personnel, turning the aircraft into a flying headquarters. However, the first versions of the C-5 encountered serious problems. The main weakness turned out to be the wings. When fully loaded, they experienced such stress that they began to crack. In the 1980s, the design had to be radically revised, replacing aluminum alloys with stronger materials. At the same time, the avionics were upgraded, making the aircraft more manageable. It was precisely thanks to these improvements that the C-5 not only survived but also remained in service for decades to come. It became a true backbone of American military logistics, an aircraft that can deliver anything, anywhere, despite its colossal size and complex design. Cargo that no one else could transport. A true time machine for military logistics, it is capable of transporting an entire combat army across continents, delivering not just soldiers to the battlefield, but all the equipment necessary for war. Its cargo hold has transported tanks, helicopters, missiles, mobile command centers, but there were also truly insane loads among them. Two M1 Abrams tanks, 140 tons of armored power, capable of destroying enemy fortifications. For any other aircraft, this would be simply an impossible task. But the C-5 Galaxy transports them with ease, leaving plenty of room for additional cargo. 7 UH-1 Huey helicopters, stored in the hold, in a folded state. Huge artillery batteries, including M198 howitzers, capable of firing over dozens of miles. But perhaps the most unexpected cargo in the history of this aircraft was the Minuteman ballistic missile. In 1974, the C-5 became part of a secret experiment. The United States tested the possibility of launching nuclear weapons from the air. The aircraft descended to 40,000 feet, released a missile, and it, activating its systems, went into free fall. It was one of the most ambitious yet risky ideas of the Cold War. Despite the successful test, the concept was deemed too dangerous and was not implemented. But the C-5 transported not only military cargo. In the 1980s, it became part of NASA's program, carrying out missions to transport parts of spacecraft. Its cargo bay was so spacious that it could transport rocket components, and even large sections of space modules that couldn't fit in other aircraft. In addition to military and space tasks, the C-5 played a key role in humanitarian missions. In 2010, after the devastating earthquake in Haiti, this aircraft transported more food and medicine in one flight than several dozen civilian cargo planes. In disaster zones, it became a rescue link, providing support where regular delivery routes were destroyed. It doesn't just move cargo, it transfers strategic capabilities from one point in the world to another. It is an indispensable tool in military and civilian aviation, which still remains the most powerful among military transport aircraft. Usually, airplanes cannot change their shape. They take off, land, but remain unchanged. The C-5 Galaxy breaks this rule. It can kneel. Its landing gear system is one of the most complex in the world. 28 wheels that not only support this giant but also turn, reducing the turning radius. This allows the giant to maneuver in confined spaces where regular transport planes simply cannot turn around. But the main feature is the automatic body lowering system. The front part of the plane can lower, reducing the incline of the cargo bay so that equipment can drive inside without the need for lifts. This saves precious time when tanks, armored vehicles, or artillery need to be loaded quickly. The nose of the plane lifts, creating a giant opening into which equipment the size of a battle tank can drive. At the same time, the rear ramp opens, and the C-5 Galaxy turns into a flying tunnel through which an entire column can pass. This makes it the only aircraft in the world that can be loaded from both sides simultaneously. It is precisely because of this design that the C-5 Galaxy can be used at airfields with limited capabilities. It is capable of landing on short runways, loading, turning around, and taking off again, performing missions that are inaccessible to other aircraft. But all this complexity comes at a price. The landing gear of the C-5 is one of the most expensive and complex maintenance systems in aviation. Due to the enormous loads, each landing causes wear on the hydraulic systems, shock absorbers, and brakes. This is why this aircraft requires regular and costly maintenance. But despite this, it is precisely because of this technology that it remains indispensable. It's not just an airplane, it's an airfield on wheels that can adapt to any mission. The C-5 Galaxy is not just a transporter, it's an airborne safe that carried items that were not meant to fall into the wrong hands. In its enormous hold, technologies, weapons, and strategic objects were hidden, the existence of which was known only to a select few. This aircraft became an indispensable tool for secret missions that are not officially acknowledged. In the 1980s, it participated in one of the most covert operations in aviation history. At that time, the United States was developing the world's first stealth fighter, the F-117 Nighthawk. This aircraft was a top-level secret, and its creation was kept under the strictest confidentiality. The only way to deliver it to military bases without the risk of being noticed was to hide it inside. The C-5 Galaxy. In a disassembled state, several of these aircraft were transported from the factory in Nevada to strategic locations, where they were assembled and prepared for their first test flights. But even more important was its involvement in the U.S. nuclear program. In the 1990s, the C-5 was used to transport components of intercontinental ballistic missiles. In a special configuration, it could carry missile sections, and in some cases, even warheads. This aircraft was the only one in the world capable of carrying out such missions quickly and discreetly. One of the most unexpected cargoes ever transported by the C-5 was gold. In the 90s, when the global economy was in an unstable state, this aircraft was used to transport the United States' strategic gold reserves. In complete silence, without official statements, it delivered tons of gold from one vault to another, ensuring the financial security of the nation. Its hold carried diplomatic cargo, important artifacts, and secret documents. It was not just a cargo plane, but a flying vault that could disappear from radar and appear at the necessary point in the world, staying out of sight. This is exactly what makes it so unique. The C-5 Galaxy is not just an aircraft, but a strategic tool capable of concealing and protecting the most important things. It is called a flying fortress, but even the most powerful machines are not immune to accidents. Over decades of service, the C-5 Galaxy has experienced several disasters, each of which could have ended the entire program. It has crashed more than once, but each time it returned to service, proving that even after the toughest trials, it remains indispensable. The most tragic accident occurred in 1975 during Operation Babylift. The C-5 Galaxy was involved in the urgent evacuation of orphans from South Vietnam. On board one of the planes were over 300 people, including dozens of infants. But just a few minutes after takeoff, the irreparable happened. A decompression of the cargo hold occurred. The hatch was torn off, and the powerful pressure drop destroyed the control system. The pilots tried to save the plane until the very end, but it lost control and crashed into the rice fields. 144 people died. This tragedy shocked the world, but the C-5 Galaxy program was not shut down. The mission continued, and the planes kept saving people. In 1992, another serious incident occurred. AC-5 was delivering military equipment when its hydraulic system failed. The plane couldn't deploy its landing gear, and the pilot had to make a difficult decision. Landing on the fuselage, this giant, weighing hundreds of thousands of pounds, slid down the runway, scattering sparks. The metal melted from the friction, but the crew managed to keep the aircraft under control. No one was injured. After repairs, this aircraft returned to service. Another incident occurred in the 2000s. AC-5 was landing in poor visibility conditions, but due to a crew error, the landing was too hard. The front landing gear collapsed, and the nose of the plane hit the runway. The damage was severe, but none of the crew members were killed. This incident was an important signal to the military that aircraft of this class require modernization. Shortly after this incident, the C-5 Galaxy modernization program received additional funding, which allowed for the upgrade of all avionics and increased flight safety. Despite these disasters, the C-5 Galaxy program not only survived, it became even stronger. Each accident became a reason for improvements, refinements, and strengthening of the structure. This aircraft has gone through fire, accidents, and upgrades, yet it continues to serve. It has proven that even the toughest trials cannot destroy it. This aircraft was supposed to be retired at the end of the 20th century. It's too big, too expensive, too complex to operate. But it couldn't be replaced. It was written off on paper. But in practice, it continued to fly because no one could create anything better. In the early 2000s, the U.S. Air Force acknowledged that the C-5 Galaxy was outdated. Its engines consumed a huge amount of fuel, and due to its complex design, it required costly maintenance. A decision was made to upgrade these aircraft, extending their service until the 2040s. Thus, the RRP program was born, a complete overhaul of the old giant into a new, more powerful machine. The first thing that was changed was the avionics. Analog instruments were replaced with digital systems, and new automatic flight control systems were implemented. The crew cabin received modern displays, which reduced the workload on pilots and increased operational accuracy in any conditions. The main innovation was the replacement of the engines. The old power units were replaced by 4 General Electric CF680C2 turbofan engines. They gave the aircraft a new lease on life, increasing thrust by 22% and reducing fuel consumption. Now the C-5M Super Galaxy could carry more cargo over longer distances without requiring frequent refueling. Additionally, the fuselage was reinforced, and the flaps and wing control mechanisms were redesigned. Improved aerodynamics allowed for an increase in maximum flight range, and the new aircraft condition monitoring system helped reduce maintenance frequency. After all these updates, the C-5 Galaxy not only did not fade into history, but also gained a new status. Now it's not just an old truck, but an upgraded machine capable of performing missions that other aircraft cannot handle. This aircraft has survived wars, disasters, and dozens of upgrades. It was deemed obsolete, but then billions of dollars were invested in it again. Why? Because even after decades, it remains the most powerful military transport aircraft in the world. The C-5 Galaxy is not just a huge aircraft. It's a moving airfield capable of transporting an army across continents. But without its engines, it would just be a gigantic hangar. It is the 4 turbofan engines that turn it into a machine capable of defying gravity. The first versions of the C-5 were equipped with TF-39 engines. They were revolutionary for their time, but by the end of the 20th century, they had become a nightmare for mechanics. These engines were incredibly noisy, fuel-hungry, and unreliable. Their power was insufficient, and due to design flaws, they required constant repairs. The situation changed with the advent of the RERP modernization program. The old engines were replaced by the General Electric CF6-80C2. This was not just an upgrade, it made the aircraft an entirely new machine. Each new engine developed thrust exceeding 51,000 pounds. In total, they provided over 200,000 pounds of force, lifting an aircraft that weighed nearly 1,000,000 pounds into the air. But more importantly, they were 30% quieter and 20% more efficient than the old engines. The new engines not only increased the flight range, but also allowed the C-5 and Super Galaxy to climb faster. This gave the aircraft a significant advantage in combat conditions. Now it could more quickly evade attacks when landing in conflict zones. Without these engines, the C-5 Galaxy would have long been consigned to the scrap heap of history. But, thanks to them, it not only remained in service but also became even more powerful. Now this aircraft is capable of covering 10,000 miles. Without refueling, delivering strategically important cargo anywhere in the world. This aircraft is not just enormous. It lives thanks to these 4 engines, which give it power, speed, and endurance. It is they that make it indispensable, even more than half a century after its first flight. This giant was created as a strategic military transport aircraft capable of operating in combat zones. But in 1989, it did something that no one expected from it. It landed in Antarctica. This giant, accustomed to concrete airfields, landed on an icy runway that could have collapsed under its enormous weight. The mission was part of Operation Deep Freeze, a large-scale program to supply the American research station McMurdo. Until that moment, supplies were delivered using ships and C-130 aircraft. Hercules, equipped with skis for landing on ice. But it was necessary to deliver cargo that no other aircraft could lift. The United States accepted the challenge. For the first time in history, to send a C-5 to the harshest place on the planet. The landing was complete madness. Weighing hundreds of thousands of pounds, the plane could have sunk into the ice. The ambient air temperature was so low that the fuel could freeze, and the hydraulic systems could become inoperative. The only runway was just compacted ice, with no protection against braking. Despite all the risks, the crew managed to land. The plane delivered hundreds of thousands of pounds of equipment, supplies, and scientific gear to Antarctica. And most amazingly, it was able to successfully take off again, proving that even in the most extreme conditions, the C-5 Galaxy remains unbeatable. This experiment demonstrated that the C-5 is capable of operating not only in hotspots but also in conditions where ordinary planes simply cannot survive. It was one of the most challenging flights in the history of military transport aviation, but the C-5 managed it. The C-5 Galaxy is not just big, it's a record holder. This aircraft has set more world records than any other military transport plane in history. Its unique payload capacity, range, and capabilities have allowed it to rewrite aviation standards. The first grand record was set in 1979. At that time, the C-5 Galaxy transported the heaviest load in aviation history, a reduction gear weighing 88 tons. It was a challenge to physics. The aircraft lifted a structure into the air that could have crushed most modern transporters. But they didn't stop there. In 1984, it achieved another milestone. It lifted a load weighing over 245,000 pounds to an altitude of 2,000 feet. This is an absolute record for military aviation, but perhaps the most outstanding was the flight in 2009. At that time, the upgraded C-5M Super Galaxy set 41 world records. It ascended to an altitude of 12,000 meters in record time, becoming the heaviest aircraft to perform a vertical climb to a certain altitude. And it even broke the achievement of the Russian strategic bomber Tu-160. The C-5 Galaxy remains an aircraft that managed to exceed all expectations. There is no other transport aircraft in the world with such a number of achievements. It has been attempted to be decommissioned more than once. They said it was outdated, too expensive, and that it was high time for it to make way for new technologies. But each time, military analysts came to the same conclusion. The C-5 Galaxy is irreplaceable. It remains the largest and most powerful military transport aircraft in history, and even more than half a century after its first flight, no one has been able to create anything better. In the early 2000s, the U.S. Air Force began looking for an alternative to the C-5. Lighter and more economical transports, such as the C-17 Globemaster, were considered. But when their payload capacity and range were compared, it became clear that none of the modern aircraft could accomplish the tasks that the C-5 can handle. But what comes next? Research is currently underway on new concepts for strategic transport aviation. One of the ideas is hypersonic transport vehicles that could move cargo to any point in the world in just a few hours. Essentially, this is a replacement of aircraft with space systems. But for now, this technology remains only on paper. Another idea is reusable transport rockets that could deliver military cargo to any point in the world via a ballistic trajectory. In theory, this would allow the US to deploy troops and equipment faster than with aircraft. But in practice, such technologies are not yet ready for real-world application. Until a revolutionary alternative appears, the C-5 Galaxy will continue its service. Its design is intended for a decade of operation. The structural reserve of most aircraft has been used less than 20%, and the upgrades carried out have allowed it to operate for at least another 2 decades. This aircraft has survived crises, disasters, upgrades, and attempts to replace it, but it is still here. It continues to carry out missions, transport cargo, and set records. And while other concepts remain on the drawing board, the C-5 Galaxy continues to rule the skies.